The Columbia Broadcasting System, in cooperation with the Office of Price Administration, presents 100 Million Questions.
I think someone ought to be able to tell us. It seems a shame to have to pay a year's rent in advance when we've just...
Yeah, I know. But I guess the guy must know what he's doing.
You guess he knows. Well, I'm not going to take his word about it. I'm going to write to Washington about it.
Write to what? Now, look, honey, you'd just be wasting your...
That's just what I'm going to do. I'm going to write to the man in charge, too, Leon Henderson. You just wait until I clear the dishes off. I'm going to find out if people like us can just be pushed around.
Day after day, from all over America, questions in letters, postcards, telegrams pour into the nation's capital addressed to the Office of Price Administration. Tonight, you will hear the answer to a few of those questions selected at random from that national mailbag. The answer will be given by the man appointed by the President to direct the programs of rationing, rent, and price control. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leon Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Announcer, and good evening, everybody. By the way, before we start trying to answer some of these questions, I'd like to say that every single letter, postcard, communication of any sort that comes properly addressed to our office here in Washington is read and considered, sometimes with 3 or 4 people if it's a difficult question, and an answer is sent out. Well, let's hear what the folks back home have to say.
This letter, Mr. Henderson, comes from a woman in Kansas City, Missouri, and she says,
Dear Mr. Henderson, I don't know why people like us are being pushed around and no one does anything about it. My husband and I and 2 children live in this 4-room house and pay $26 a month. The landlord, who wanted us to pay $30, but the rent control wouldn't let him, now wants us to pay 1 year rent in advance. We have no money for a year's rent, but he says he has a right to do this if he doesn't raise the rent. And I want to know what use rent control is, if he can get away with it.
Well, the answer to that is that the landlord is not entitled to advance rent. If she paid by the month on the maximum rent date established for Kansas City, she can continue to pay by the month. A year's rent in advance would result in a substantial burden on the tenant over and above what was customary in her case. If we allowed practices like that, we'd have left a hole in the rent control big enough to drive a truck through. Now, talking about annual rents, I'd like to point out that without rent control, the average tenant right now would be paying the equivalent of 14 months' rent instead of 12. We can check that one up in favor of rent control. What's the next one?
This one comes from a man in Vermont, Mr. Henderson. He wants to know,
We are trying to help our government in every way we can. But sometimes we wonder what you men in charge of our government are doing. How does it come, with all this talk of rationing, that sugar and tires and gasoline are still being used to make and transport intoxicating beverages instead of put to good use?
Well, Mr. Vermont, something is being done. Right now, no sugar at all is being used to produce industrial alcohol, except what alcohol goes right to making smokeless powder and synthetic rubber. And since late July, I think it was the 28th, the tire rationing regulations that I issued have cut off all new tires to privately operated trucks carrying alcoholic beverages, soft drinks, tobacco products, and a lot of other items.
here's a postcard from a man in Mobile, Alabama. He says,
My landlord says he sold this house and wants us to move out. This is an old game of his, making phony sales to get folks to move. I've heard of other cases like this. Is this right according to law? Write to this address and tell me where people like us stand.
Well, let's see. Mobile. Yeah, that's under rent control. Well, I've no way of knowing whether or not that's a phony sale, but Mr. Mobile can find out by going to the rent office. The landlord may be complying with regulations that became effective October 20th. They stated specifically that if the house is sold to anybody but the tenant that's living in it, a down payment of 1/3 the purchase price must change hands before the rent director will issue a certificate of eviction. And 3 months must elapse after that before the tenant has to move out. That was meant to put a stop to those fly-by-night sales, and I'm glad to say that it is putting a stop to them. What's next?
This is from a woman in Connecticut. She writes,
Dear Mr. Henderson, I don't like to complain, but isn't it silly to make householders like us measure every single room in our homes on our hands and knees to find out how much fuel oil we should get? It seems to me it would be much simpler and more sensible all around to just allow us some certain percentage of the fuel oil we used last year. Surely there must be some other method of rationing oil without having us crawl around with a yardstick and fill out a long form with a lot of square feet. Sometimes I think you people in Washington do things the hard way.
And sometimes I think so, too, but not in this fuel oil case. When this fuel oil shortage threatened, and it was a real threat of shortage, We explored the various systems of rationing fuel oil, and eventually we came up with this one as the most equitable all around and the most likely to keep people from freezing. As a matter of fact, we considered the idea of allotting to each householder a percentage of the oil he used last year. But that would have worked an unfair hardship on a great many people. You take, for example, before this oil shortage showed up, there was some foresighted person might have thoroughly insulated his house and installed storm windows and weather stripping. And he cut his last winter's oil consumption to, say, something like 1,000 gallons. On the other hand, his next-door neighbor might have failed to insulate and run his house with half his windows open and used up 1,500 gallons. Suppose they both got two-thirds of last year's. The first man would get 600-odd gallons. That's insufficient to heat his house, and no way of conserving fuel because the house would be already insulated to the limit. Under that percentage system, his neighbor would also get two-thirds, or about 1,000 gallons, and still be able to insulate his house and end up with more than his fair share of warmth. In other words, allowing a percentage of last year's fuel oil would serve to penalize the thrifty and the foresighted householder and reward the indifferent and the careless. The system we adopted, based on floor area of a house and leaving it up to the householder himself to put his own home in order, is the fairest system of dividing up the available supply. Naturally, there can never be a 100% perfect, foolproof rationing program. But this is the nearest we can come to it, and I'm glad to say that with the help of the rationing boards and the public's own common sense, it's working. Let's hear the next letter.
It's from a man in Florida who says,
My wife and I and one son live in a trailer camp, and we pay $3 a week for the space we have. The owner of the camp tried to raise the rent, but we have rent control, and he had to drop his rent. Yesterday, he stopped garbage collections and cut down on the water supply because he said it cost too much money. Can he get away with this? On trailer camps protected? My wife and I both do war work.
Answering both questions, trailer camps are protected where rent control is in effect. And the owner of the land can't get away with depriving the tenants of service such as garbage collection or water supply that was customary before the maximum rent date. A case like that should be reported to the area rent director, and any local rationing board can tell you where to go. Next.
A woman in Brooklyn sends in a postcard.
I heard over the radio about this nylon stocking card I could get by writing to you. I sure would love to get 2 pair, as I have never owned any nylon. The girl in the store said there were no nylons, but I said she better not charge high prices or the government will get you. So she said, if you can get any, you are welcome to them. So I left. But later on, I am going back when they release nylons to see what she charges and get a pair, because I feel like I should have a pair like everybody else. So send me a card, please. Thank you.
We'll send her a price card. They're the rigid ceiling prices for nylons now in every factory and wholesale house and retailer in the country for each grade. Whether or not there's enough to go around is another thing. I'd like to point out, however, that the card the lady speaks of will not entitle her to a pair of stockings. They're not being rationed. This is simply a price card giving the ceiling prices for her protection when she's buying the various grades.
Here's another one, Mr. Henderson, from a man in New Jersey.
I've been living here for 3 months, paying $30 a month for 5 rooms and attached garage. Recently, I discovered that the rent had only been $22 a month before our freeze date. The landlord claims he is allowed to charge more because he added the garage and an extra room and insulated the house. I claim that's his hard luck being a landlord. Who is right?
The landlord's right. Under rent control, the landlord is entitled to a higher rent than he got on the maximum rent date if he can prove that he has meanwhile made a substantial alteration to the house. That tenant's being unreasonable, and from the tone of that letter, I'd say he got the wrong bull by the horns. Rent control isn't a device to crack down on landlords. It's meant to correct abuses and inequities, and it works both ways. While I'm on that subject, I'd like to say that in spite of an occasional obstructionist, the great majority of landlords are giving us the fullest of cooperation. Without that cooperation, we couldn't have got to first base. What's the next one?
Here's a postcard from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
How can you expect everybody to get along on the same ration of coffee? My husband works nights and needs extra coffee besides 1 pound for 5 weeks.
I suppose that's a legitimate complaint. Some people aren't going to need that coffee ration, and some could use a lot more. But differential rationing of a food commodity presents a tough problem. If we started breaking it down into specific rations for certain trades or hours of work or age groups or geographic location or physical needs, well, we'd never get around to getting the coffee distributed. We've got to depend on individual families to handle their special family problems as best they can.
Here's one from a woman in New York City. She says,
Shouldn't some extra allowance of fuel oil be allowed for old people or sick people or very young children? I have a girl of 3 and a 6-month-old boy, and I'm sure we're going to need a warmer house for them than what we would have with a normal ration.
Well, that's been provided for in the fuel regulations. Whether one or more children under 4 years old, there's an increase allowed depending on location. The country's been divided into what the experts call thermal zones. For example, New York City is in thermal zone B. That's next to the coldest zone. In her case, the ration will be increased by 100 gallons of fuel oil. Where invalids are involved, extra rations will be allowed on doctor's certificate.
this letter comes from a town in Idaho.
We rural people are all in favor of having coffee rations. We didn't have any for 4 weeks. Because we lived so far from the store, we never knew when they were giving it out. Why don't we have every article of food rationed? Then we would have our share, like the city people have.
Well, that question appears hundreds of times in our mail. Why doesn't OPA ration all food? The answer is, first of all, we work on orders. We get our directives on oil, for example, from Secretary Ickes, on food from Secretary Wickard. Mr. Jeffords is the boss when it comes to rubber, and Mr. Eastman on transportation. All other matters are handled by Don Nelson. They tell OPA when and what to ration, and when they recommend rationing some particular commodity, our job in OPA is to set up the machinery to do it. But their recommendations are based on certain needs for the war program. And until those needs arise, there's no sense in rationing just for the sake of rationing. There's no fun in it, I can tell you. There's been no rationing so far, and there won't be any if I have anything to do with it. That isn't necessary because of developing shortage.
Here's one from New York City, Mr. Henderson. This letter reads,
You keep talking about price control bringing down the cost of keeping house. The cry has been less meat and more eggs and poultry. But at the prices they're asking for eggs and poultry, it's out of the question for the average housewife to give any of them to her family. What I want to know is, why is all this talked of price control failing to help us? And what good is it ever going to do us? Try and answer that.
Well, I can't answer that. The answer is that price control is not failing. Some of those prices that are mentioned are due to the law relating to agricultural commodities, and she knows it. It's saving money, price control is, for the housewife right now. And if we all work together and keep the present price levels intact, there's going to be an average saving of $180 per person. Not per family, but per person by this time next year. I mean, that's compared to the last war when we had a real price inflation. Now take the price of eggs, for example. During the last war, eggs brought 92 cents a dozen and better. Last October, they were 58 cents a dozen. During the last war, butter went to 78 cents a pound and higher as compared to 54 cents a pound now. And 15 pounds of potatoes during the First World War would have cost that lady $1.54 as against 51 cents a couple months ago. Those high prices of the last war are what we might be paying now if it weren't for price control, having put a lid on the cost of living. There's a similar story in rents under rent control, too. Well, I see by the clock that our time's about up. I'm afraid we've only scratched the surface when it comes to answering the inquiries, the questions, and problems that come to us from the OPA. Those few we've heard tonight leave a good many questions unanswered, but they're fairly typical of the sort we receive. And the men and women that write those letters are, for the most part, sincere. And they are right in thinking that in a democracy like ours, people are entitled to be heard by those they have hired to manage their affairs. And they have a right to complain, too, and directly to headquarters, and if they don't like the way their affairs are being managed. That, to me, seems the only way a democracy can function successfully.
100 Million Questions with Price Administrator Leon Henderson comes to you each Thursday at the same time over most of these same stations. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.